a Mexican newspaper has printed its final edition.
The decision to close came after reporter Miroslava Breach's death in Chihuahua City.
Miroslava Breach un hombre se le acercó a su camioneta y le disparó.
La prensa en general está arrodillada ante el
Corresponsal del periódico La Jornada y trabajaba para el Norte de Ciudad Juarez. Su voz era crítica y defensora de derechos humanos.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. Mexico, where journalists get killed for telling the story, and the killers don't care who knows it. News consumers come with a bias, and new online news outlets are feeding them what they want to hear, whether it's real or fake news. The Israeli coalition government almost falls apart before coming together again over the issue of a new national broadcaster. And just who are you calling a left-wing blog? The investigative outlet ProPublica takes on the White House's press secretary. This week, a newspaper in Mexico's Ciudad Juarez called El Norte published its final edition, shutting down its printing presses. The reason given had nothing to do with digital technology or slumping ad revenues, the things newspapers around the world are struggling against. The owner said he was closing his paper after 27 years because continuing to report the news in Mexico is just too dangerous. The most recent journalist killed there was Miroslava Breach, a correspondent for the national paper La Jornada, who was shot dead by an assailant who left a note at the scene which read, "For being a loudmouth." Breach was one of 3 journalists killed in March, all of whom were reporting on crime, corruption, or the drug trade. Mexico is the deadliest country in the Western Hemisphere to report from. And what galls journalists there is that the murders of their colleagues routinely go unpunished. Charges are few, prosecutions are rare, and convictions almost never happen. That culture of impunity has many in the media theorizing that the police and the prosecutors who should be targeting drug barons are in fact working for the wrong side. And many media outlets in Mexico, El Norte included, are financially dependent on state governments for lucrative advertising contracts, which means that they may be compromised in their work as well. Between the conflicts affecting the various players, allegations of official corruption, the ever-present threat of violence from the drug cartels, and the mounting death toll, there's a surplus of news stories in Mexico and one fewer newspaper to report on them. Our starting point this week is Ciudad Juarez.
Impunity is really the fuel that keeps aggressions running. And that is because any person who right now wants to impose censorship on journalists, on the media, by violent means, knows that he can get away with it. And the way that he knows that is because the person who did it before him got away with it.
It was a one-word headline. A 27-year-old newspaper saying goodbye to its readers. A little more than a week after the latest murder of a Mexican journalist who had done some work for El Norte, its owner-editor wrote that due to the fact that, among other things, there are neither the guarantees nor the security to exercise critical, counterbalanced journalism, his paper was closing.
The case of our journalist, our contributor Miroslava Breach, opened my eyes. It made me think about the fate of the journalists who have been murdered and about the investigations that haven't led to any findings. It also made me think about how in 27 years we have had to overcome so much adversity.
It is very dangerous for a newspaper to operate in these regions. What I know about the case of El Norte is that they were already facing severe financial problems that threatened to end their operations. In my opinion, the killing that took place recently only accelerated the decision.
With 8 journalists killed between 2014 and 2016, Mexico is on a par with Iraq and almost as perilous for reporters as Syria. But unlike conventional war zones like Syria, where reporters can be collateral damage, victims of crossfire, the media casualties in Mexico are all targeted, and few killers ever pay the price. Of the 23 journalists murdered between 2006 and 2016, only 2 cases ended with convictions, an impunity rate of 91%. The other thing that sets the killers of journalists in Mexico apart is how brazen they are. Leaving notes at the scene, which happened after the Miroslava Breach murder, is typical. And it's not just journalists. bloggers, or others online critical of the drug trade have also been killed, strung up for the world to see with notes attached. And not all of the messages the murderers leave behind are scribbled down on a piece of paper.
In 2014, we documented the case of María del Rosario Fuentes. She used to speak out on violence in the state of Tamaulipas, especially coming from drug cartels. She was abducted, and her Twitter account was taken by the perpetrators. And they started tweeting how she was being beaten and how they supposedly murdered her.
Attacks against journalists are so bold because they are tolerated. There is impunity. Even when politicians say in their speeches that they are going to address these issues, the truth is nothing happens. They don't bring the criminals to justice, and this sends the message that no action will be taken.
This story is not as clear-cut as drug gangs, criminals, and the corrupt killing journalists, and then governments at the state and national level failing to prosecute. They have been accused of working together, being intertwined. The press freedom group Article 19 monitors media around the globe. It tracks all forms of aggression against Mexican journalists, from verbal threats to cases of physical assault, all the way up to murders. It reports that last year there were a total of 426 such incidents in Mexico, 53% of which it blamed on public officials at different levels of government, the same governments that come up woefully short when investigating the killings of journalists.
So if we're saying that more than 50% of the attacks are coming from government officials, and they are the ones in charge of investigating the cases of violence against the press, it's not so hard to understand why we have 99.7% of impunity in cases of violence against the press. Government officials don't want to investigate these cases because they know they will come directly back at them.
The problem with especially the murders of journalists is that sometimes the reaction of the authorities has been, no, he was into something. No, he was consorting with criminals. No, he was having an affair and this was like a passionate crime or whatever. Because they don't want to appear as though they cannot guarantee freedom of expression. So whenever a journalist gets killed or attacked or kidnapped, beaten, their first instinct is to blame it on something else.
Self-censorship among Mexican journalists is common, and not all of it is the result of violence, real or threatened, at the hands of criminals. Many media outlets, like the recently closed El Norte, are reliant on government advertising to stay in the black. And when the primary democratic institution that you cover is effectively keeping you afloat, that's yet another reason for Mexican journalists to watch what they say, to self-censor, as if they needed one.
Most of the media in Mexico survive thanks to official advertising, and every government believes it has absolute power regarding how to use taxpayers' money. Therefore, while the use of public funds should be regulated, what happens is that different state institutions use the funds to control what can or cannot be published in the media.
The government uses money as a tool. If you behave well, I'll pay you on time. If you don't behave well, I will not pay you on time. Sometimes they just don't include you in their budget. It is an instrument to control the media.
Because when the government is writing the checks, even media that is privately owned can, to a degree, be state-controlled. Covering the drug trade and the risks that come with that is not the only problem Mexico's journalists face. It's just the most lethal, the one that gets the headlines. The issues, the tales of collusion and compromise, run much deeper than that. On the download now, our viewers on the perilous state of journalism in Mexico.
Local journalists are just easy targets for organized crime and the political class members who feel vexed by their work. Corruption is everywhere, and accountability is just used as an ornament in public speeches.
As a journalist student in Mexico, from violence to intimidation, there's a very, very fine line. And to decide to be self-censorship is also to self-defend. But still, impunity is the worst enemy.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week. Israel's new public broadcaster, Kan, continues to be a major news story there. And the channel, which is now 3 years in the making, has yet to go on the air. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Finance Minister Moshe Kahlon reached an agreement on the issue which had threatened to break up Netanyahu's coalition government. Under the deal, Kan, which was created to replace Israel's longtime broadcast authority, the IBA, with an independent corporation, will not have its own news division. It will go on the air April 30th, but its news department will continue to be run by the IBA until another news division, independent of Kan's management, is established. Netanyahu argues that he is out to save the jobs of journalists at the IBA. However, his critics say that he fears a Kan news division would be too liberal and difficult to control. On April 1st, hundreds of Kan's employees protested the new arrangement, and the channel's chairman, Gil Omer, did not mince words. This week, we became Turkey or Russia, he said. The government has come in and taken control of a public broadcasting body. They're throwing away hundreds of workers just because 3 or 4 of them aren't to the Prime Minister's liking. Fox remains President Trump's 24-hour news network of choice, but the stories of sexual harassment that keep coming out of there now have advertisers distancing themselves from the channel's most popular program. 22 companies, including BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Mitsubishi, have withdrawn their advertising after an investigation by the New York Times revealed that the network has now settled 5 cases of sexual harassment against Bill O'Reilly, who hosts The O'Reilly Factor. 2 of those cases were already public. However, the Times detailed 3 more and reported that a total of $13 million has been paid out in out-of-court settlements. The sexual harassment stories at Fox don't end with O'Reilly. Earlier this week, Fox News contributor Julie Rodzinski slapped the network, current co-president Bill Shine, and former chairman Roger Ailes with another lawsuit asserting that she faced professional retaliation for rebuffing Mr. Ailes' sexual advances. Roger Ailes was ousted from Fox last year after a former anchor, Gretchen Carlson, and others accused the network's co-founder of sexual harassment. In India, a journalist is facing criminal charges for a report on the army there that police say led to a soldier committing suicide. The prosecution stems from a sting operation conducted by the English-language news site The Quint, published 6 weeks ago. A reporter named Poonam Agarwal filed a piece from an army camp, reportedly without permission, on the alleged exploitation of junior soldiers by senior officers. The video, recorded using a hidden camera, seemingly without the soldiers' permission, sees them, faces obscured, criticizing superiors for forcing them to do, among other things, their personal chores. The Quint took the story down March 3rd after one of the soldiers was found dead. Police said he took his own life. But according to the soldier's wife, he feared reprisals for the comments he made. The ethics of the Quint's sting operation have been called into question, with the Indian website News Laundry saying that Quint has some serious questions to answer, while the online outlet The Wire called the story irresponsible, overzealous journalism. The journalist involved now stands accused of spying, criminal trespassing, and abetment to suicide. She faces a maximum sentence of 29 years in prison. According to her, this is nothing but an attempt by the Indian Army to shut up journalists from exposing wrongdoings in the institution, forcing journalists in future to think twice before raising their voices against the army. We've spent a lot of time at the Listening Post examining the fake news phenomenon. This week, we want to take a look at a kind of journalism that is a close cousin of fake news, the sort of reporting that tells people what they want to hear as opposed to what they need to know, reporting that reinforces partisan opinions rather than challenging them. As a recent BuzzFeed investigation revealed, it's the kind of output that a Miami-based company called American News LLC specializes in. And it does so not for ideological reasons, for commercial ones. So it often covers the same story 2 different ways, sending a liberal, lefty version of it into one side of the blogosphere, while conservatives get a different take, dotted with right-wing arguments and buzzwords that push their buttons. Sometimes it isn't just ideologically filtered, it's also flat out fake. Companies like American News LLC get plenty of clicks because, according to a study, it takes just a few believers to set off a news item on the social web. Consumers are often much less concerned about the outlet doing the reporting, where the story originated, than they are about who does the actual sharing, whose Facebook feed you'll find it on, whose tweet takes you to the article, or which friend sends it your way. The Listening Post's Tarek Nafi now on partisan news media and the part that they play in the fake news ecosystem. Or is that ecosystem?
The social web, home to a vast ecosystem of news outlets, many of them hyper-partisan, spanning the political spectrum, straddling the line between what is true and what is false, often churning out content that simply tells people what they want to hear. One of these news outlets, American News LLC, has a formula that shows just how easy it is to exploit our biases.
One day as I was kind of looking at their content, I noticed that a story that was on one of their conservative pages was almost identical to a story that had appeared on a liberal website. Of course, the conservative story was about Kellyanne Conway and had expressed a lot of support for her. The liberal story was really going after her. And what I realized was that this company was actually playing both sides.
They use the same exact stories and the same exact formulas for the right and the left. It's very low effort and high output. So they don't really need to tweak that much of anything except putting in the names of people that they know will get them to click. Like Hillary Clinton will get pretty much anybody on the right to click on it. If she's going to jail or something terrible has happened to her, it doesn't matter if there's any truth to it whatsoever. People will click on it and pass it around. And the same thing is true on the left. Anything to do with Donald Trump will get clicked on and passed around.
The hyperpartisan sites have always kind of pushed right to the edge of what's misleading or what's true, and the growth of these hyperpartisan sites has kind of laid the groundwork for political fake news in some ways.
We contacted American News LLC to ask them about their editorial and business model, but received no response. The growth of the partisan news landscape has been decades in the making. The commercialization of journalism and the deepening of political divides have helped drive it. In the United States, before the internet turbocharged the spread of partisan outlets online, there was talk radio, dominated by strident conservative hosts, and Fox News, which emerged as the televised voice of the Republican Party, later followed by MSNBC on the left. Over the last quarter century, as the internet has offered platforms to anyone with a point of view, there has been an explosion of partisan media.
I did a study for Axios in which I observed 89 news websites that have launched over the past 25 years. And what I found is there have been very few nonpartisan websites that have launched. Most mainstream news websites launched when the internet launched, really in the mid to late 90s. But ever since, it's been hard for nonpartisan news to enter the ecosystem.
And audiences, news consumers, are partly to blame for that. Multiple studies have concluded that we have an appetite for content that feeds our biases, and an aversion to material that doesn't. The New York Times recently commissioned a web analytics company called Chartbeat to track 148 news sites that span the political divide. It found that by and large, most outlets on the right and the left covered the same news events, but that readers would often skip stories that don't suit their particular biases. In short, in the supply and demand world of news, audiences generally demand information that fits with what they already believe.
There's a natural tendency for people to like stories that already agree with their point of view. People see, oh, that fits with my preconception, so I tend to accept it, so I maybe just uncritically sort of think that that's true without stopping, pausing, and reflecting on why, I might want to be more skeptical of some of these claims.
People are being bombarded with so much information, they almost just don't know what to do with it. And so it makes sense that people are going to gloss over information that doesn't necessarily seem appealing to them at the time. But one really interesting thing to understand about news consumption and why people are choosing to read some things over another There have been a lot of studies that suggest that the trust in American media is diminishing. The latest Gallup survey said that the American trust in media was at an all-time low in September, which was 68% of people distrusting the media. That's people distrusting real news, not just fake news, but things that they see that they just don't like.
The trust in media has been declining, especially in mainstream media, for decades now. And I do think as that starts to happen and as people have so many options online, they tend to gravitate towards sources that reinforce what their views are and what their beliefs are. So that decline of trust, the democratization of media, have really, I think, set the stage for partisan media to have what I think is kind of a reawakening right now.
The partisan media phenomenon is powered by platforms like Reddit and other social media spaces like YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. Facebook's algorithms, the code that filters material we see on our feeds, prioritize content that users have shown a tendency to engage with. So if you liked or shared an article from a particular outlet, chances are content from that outlet will keep resurfacing on your feed. It's a process that helps build a media bubble without much attention being paid to how partisan or even fake the content might be. Another element of social media-driven news consumption is that people trust other people in their circle. A news outlet, the actual source of a news report, is less important than who is getting that article or video to you.
One way in which social media has contributed to this is that people tend to say, oh, my friend Jim or my friend Mary like the story, they're a credible person, so maybe I attach more credibility then to that story. Well, if they liked it, then there's a good chance it might be true.
Today, rather than choosing a specific newspaper or a specific newscast to patronize all the time, you're getting information that's coming from Facebook and you don't really know what the source is right away. It's coming from friends of yours who are sending you stuff in emails or messaging apps. And so that kind of erosion of the close identification with the source, I think makes it easy for a fake news website that may only be a few weeks or months old, that looks kind of real, to get out there and people sort of think like, oh, maybe this is real.
I think an unfair amount of pressure has been placed on news consumers to be able to tell fake news from real news. That's what we journalists are supposed to be there for, right? There's been this ongoing process by which news media went from being a public service to being seen as profitable. The sad truth is news is not financially viable.
I think there are people who they realize there's more money in playing both sides. And one of the comments when I published the American News LLC story that I thought was really good is that when it comes to the fight game, it's the promoter who really makes the most money. And so when you're promoting a fight between conservatives and liberals and you're playing both sides, you walk away at the end of the day making the most out of that.
And in the absence of vetted and contextualized and solid news information, people are just going to go for fake news if it looks plausible enough, because that is human nature. And they're hungry for knowledge. And journalists once knew this, but I think that we have either forgotten or we've all just kind of, gotten laid off.
Finally, just because a left-wing blog makes the point of something changing doesn't mean it actually happened. Those are the words of Sean Spicer, U.S. President Donald Trump's press secretary. He was talking about ProPublica, an investigative news organization that recently published a piece about Trump's private financial dealings. This is clearly part of the White House's strategy of taking any critical reporting of the president and just dismissing it as fake news. Now, Spicer may have had a point on the way ProPublica is funded. It's bankrolled by a billionaire couple who are also donors to the Democratic Party. But ProPublica's reporting is very difficult to argue with. In 2010, it became the first online outlet to win a Pulitzer Prize for excellence in American journalism and has since won 2 more. ProPublica also has a Twitter feed, and it used it to dismantle Spicer's argument point by painstaking point, and also took advantage of the platform that the press secretary had provided it with to reshare and remind Americans of its best journalistic work. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
Just because a left-wing blog makes the point of something changing doesn't mean it actually happened.